Returning from the ashes with the new online Magic game, Magic Arena. Deck building with Bahumaut is also back. Today we're going to start simple, and there's very few things more simple than pure red aggro. So I'm going to focus this deck on a couple of different aspects. However, of course, as with all the deck designs that I create, feel free to tinker, adjust, edit, change, do whatever you want to it. Essentially, the idea is it's always a skeleton that you can build on to create your own personalized and unique deck. Of course, if you're happy with the default setup, go for it. Creature-wise, I'm going to be mainly interested in elementals. Now, this will come into play a little bit later, but for now, just keep in mind there is a reason that I'm only picking elemental creatures, aside from one exception. So, one of our cheap damage dealers straight off the bat is Scorch Spitter. So essentially this is our turn 1 play, and of course it still remains useful afterwards due to a combination of other factors that I'll go over as we get there. So as you can see, it's a simple 1/1 for 1 mana, but the main thing of interest to us is its additional damage whenever it attacks. Now of course, that can be dealt to an opponent or a planeswalker. Keep in mind of course that you can't target a creature with that additional damage. As you'll note, it's an elemental, just keep it in mind for later, and we'll add 4 copies in as it's definitely one of our base creatures that this deck is built around. Plus it's also nice to have a turn 1 move. Combine our Scorch Spitter's bonus damage, considering it's 1/1, with Cavalcade of Calamity. This one is essentially one of the cornerstones of the deck. This is how you inflict a lot of damage to your opponent. It's also uncommon, so fairly easy to get. So whenever any creature with power 1 or less, so if you keep that in mind, you could also include creatures which have power of 0 and they would still inflict damage. The idea is essentially that we're going to have or create a lot of creatures with power 1, and there are multiple ways to do that which are included in this deck. So we put in all 4 copies because we want as high a chance to draw this as possible. Our next elemental that combines really well with this deck is Chandra's Spitfire. So 1/3 flyer, gives us some flying defense. I mean, it's not huge flying defense, but it's there. And as you can read, whenever an opponent is dealt non-combat damage, so that includes our Cavalcade of Calamities, 1 damage, as well as our Scorch Spitter, Chandra's Spitfire gets +3/+0 until end of turn. Considering each time that effect is triggered by our little 1/1s, this Spitfire gets massive quick. So simple attacks, you can be hitting 15 damage quite easily. It's also an elemental, so will gel really well with a later effect. Now a nice little bonus to this deck is that Chandra gels really well with it. Not so much her first effect, although that is a nice defensive move. You're mainly looking at the second one. Create 2 1/1 red elemental creature tokens. They gain haste, sacrifice them at the beginning of the next step. So that's an additional 2 cheap 1/1 creatures that are already attacking. So once again triggering Cavalcade of Calamity, which triggers Chandra's Spitfire, and lots of other effects. Plus, of course, you could use that in a sacrifice deck or some other particular way of using it. The -2 effect can be useful from time to time though, due to the cheap cost of the spells we're going to include. You can essentially recover a red spell from the graveyard and cast it again. The only thing to keep in mind is that you still need to pay the spell cost, unlike some other Planewalker's effects. So don't bring a spell back that you can't afford to cast. So we'll put 2 copies of that in there. While she is useful, her creatures that she creates aren't permanent. I wouldn't put in all 4 copies of her, she's nice to have but not crucial. Now of course, one of the banes of red decks in general is just the fact that your creatures can get spelled away. Leyline of Combustion makes that a little bit more tricky for your opponent, because every time one of your creatures is targeted by a spell, in response it deals 2 damage. And of course that triggers Chandra's Spitfire effect, which can make retaliation quite interesting, especially if they cast spells on one of your creatures while you're attacking, because then Chandra's Spitfire just gets bigger and hits for more damage. While the effect is extremely useful, it is quite expensive, but the advantage of Leyline is the fact that if it's in your opening hand, you can play it for free onto the board straight away. This downgrades the cost of Leyline overall. So of course, well, you could get lucky and get it for free. If you are required to pay for it, well, size up what sort of deck your opponent is using, if they're likely to cast spells on their creatures or yours. If they're more likely to cast spells on their own creatures, well, you may as well hold this in your hand and play some more creatures or some other spells instead. Not to say that it becomes useless or anything, but it can be situational at times. Sometimes it can be a lifesaver if you're versing a deck that boomerangs or returns creatures to your hand, for example. Very blue heavy decks, red spell decks, blue and red mixes, black. So essentially decks that aren't heavily creature focused will often find this a very painful thorn in their side when versing you. Due to the high mana cost, however, probably don't want to include more than 2 copies in your deck. And this is one of the big playmakers of the deck. This is Scampering Scorcher. Like the rest of our creatures, we have 1 power, but the additional effect is it creates 2 other red elemental creature tokens that also gain haste. Now keep in mind, all elementals gain haste for that turn, and since our creatures are almost purely elementals, this means if you play any additional creatures as well as it, they'll gain haste as well. So you'll get additional creatures and potential haste bonuses from this card. You'll also trigger your Cavalcade of Calamity effects, and that in turn triggers Chandra Spitfire. So essentially you can see how it creates a cascade of effects, all coming off this one card. Due to the power of all of these triggers, we're going to include 4 copies in the deck, even though it has a high mana cost. Now this is probably one of the biggest game changers when you play this card. Now essentially any time that you would deal red damage in any way, shape or form, you add an additional 2 to that damage. So that means that all our little 1 damage effects suddenly become a lot more painful. And of course he's a nice 2/4 defender that you could use. He is pretty much the perfect card to add to any red aggro deck. Due to its amazing powers, we're going to include as many copies as we have. He is a rare, so basically just add as many copies as you can. As you get more copies of him, it essentially will power up your deck more and more. And our mythic planeswalker for this deck, as I often like to include at least 1 planeswalker that matches the theme, we have here Chandra, Awakened Inferno. Of course, if you don't have this card, you can always replace it with another copy of one of the cards already in the deck, or something else you think will work well. So, nice bonus straight off the bat that it cannot be countered. This means you'll have a nice little effect against blue decks, which often like to counter your spells. And you'll also see that the +2 gives a permanent 1 damage per turn emblem to your opponent. And of course, if you have Torbran that we just looked at, that 1 damage then becomes 3 damage, and increases as you can also stack these emblems on top of each other. So for every turn that you trigger the +2 effect, they'll take an additional 1 point of damage for each emblem that you use. We also have her -3 ability, which is a nice board clear, and since most of our creatures, almost all of our creatures, are elementals, you can essentially turn this into a low power nuke. If you have Torbran out, you can nuke up to 5 damage to every creature that is not an elemental. Now that's a board clear, and her final ability allows you to deal targeted damage, which is quite handy from time to time if there's a specific creature that's causing you trouble. This is often a good counter against flyers or creatures that sit there with passive or active effects and aren't actually involved in combat. So we will include 1 copy of her. Now despite her amazing powers, she is an extremely expensive card, so we will only include 1 copy. Now what would a red deck be without a few spells? For us, our bread and butter in regards to spells is Chandra's Pyrohelix. Now while it only deals 2 damage, you can choose 1 or 2 targets for that 2 damage. Why would we want to split the damage? Well, so it's not wasted, but the main reason is for when we have Torbran. And also, a nice little bonus for us is it can also trigger Chandra's Spitfire. So say for example, we have a 1/1 flyer out that we're finding difficult to get rid of. So we cast Chandra's Pyrohelix, dealing 1 damage to the flyer, and then we use the additional 1 damage to target the player. That then triggers Chandra's Spitfire, allowing us to attack for much more damage. Of course, if we have Torbran out, then that 1 damage becomes 3 damage. So you would essentially be getting 2 lots of 3 damage on 1 or 2 targets. As you can see, it's quite a multi-purpose spell. So we shall put all 4 copies in. Now this is another 1-2 combo. So Cosmotronic Wave. If you read through the description, so it deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. All creatures your opponents control can't block this turn. For 4 mana, it doesn't seem like such a great deal. So 1 damage, the only real use that could be is if your opponent has a lot of 1/1 creatures. Fair enough. But you got to keep in mind that 1 damage can always be turned into more damage. And to do that, if we look back at Tabran, so our 1 damage to all creatures your opponent controls becomes 3 damage. Also keep in mind that your opponent's creatures can't block in retaliation. So essentially this is one of your end game cards. If you have Tabran, good supply of little creatures, and play Cosmotronic Wave, very difficult for your opponent to come up with a usable defense. Due to the high cost and difficulty sometimes in getting the combination in hand, we'll only put in 2 copies of this card. However, if timed right, it can be a devastating option. Acting as a combination of Reviver and Trigger Effector, we have Thunderkin Awakener. Now 2 mana for a 1/2 with haste, doesn't sound that great. However, read through his ability and he becomes a lot more interesting. Since nearly all of our creatures are elementals, that means nearly all of them are viable for his special ability. Choose target elemental creature card in your graveyard with toughness less than Thunderkin Awakener's toughness. 2. Return that card to the battlefield tapped and attacking. Sacrifice it at the beginning of next end step. Thunderkin also has haste, so it means this ability is triggered almost straight away as soon as you go into combat. Now keep in mind, when a creature is returned to the battlefield, it can then trigger its own effects, and there's one in particular that I'm looking at, Scampering Scorcher. So as soon as it comes into play, you get an additional 2 1/1 red elemental creatures without having to pay for it. Now you'll lose Scampering Scorcher at the end of combat due to Thunderkin Awakener's secondary effect, but the summoned tokens will still remain in play. So essentially it's a nice little 1/2 punch. You're getting the chance to cast a 4 mana spell for 2 mana. And you have permanent tokens, so there's nothing really wrong with that. Personally, I would put in 2 copies of this, but you can include more if you want to bring back more creatures and that kind of thing. As I said before, nearly all the creatures in the deck are elementals, so this ability is pretty much always useful. And lastly on our spell front, we have Light Up the Stage. Now one of the main problems with a red aggro deck is you'll run out of cards. Okay, it's just what happens. Now red doesn't have a huge amount of options in order to gain additional cards quickly, unlike blue or black. However, you can essentially borrow cards from next turn, and to do that we use Light Up the Stage. Now one of the new abilities brought in by these new expansions are Spectacle. So the idea is when you deal damage to an opponent, you can pay for spells with a reduced cost, similar to Madness from earlier expansions. Now the thing of interest to us is the fact that we gain access to 2 additional cards for the potential cost of 1 mana. Now that's a pretty good deal, especially for red. The downside is, of course, that if we get a bad draw from those 2 cards, as in cards we can't play or cards that aren't particularly of use to us at the moment, then those cards are lost. They're exiled. But with a red deck, of course, you're always scrabbling for mana or additional creatures or additional spells. Getting the chance to access some of those outweighs the potential for loss in my mind. And since we have the potential for a lot of indirect damage, we quite often gain access to the Spectacle cost of only 1 mana. So it's quite a good deal overall, I think. Of course, you can always add in more set effects such as Risk Factor, which will deal 4 damage or allow you to draw more cards, or Thrill of Possibility. And I like to include 3 copies of that card, just to keep the deck speedy and moving. Finally, we'll have a quick look at lands. Now there are 2 special red lands, or red only lands, and these are Dwarven Mine, which is quite valid, you could use it. It'll give you a free 1/1 red dwarf token, and since you're playing a pure red deck, it means you're very likely to draw the 3 required mountains. However, I like Castle Embereth much better, because you can trigger the 3 mana effect after Cavalcade of Calamity has triggered. So your 1/1 creatures will trigger their effect of Cavalcade, dealing 1 point of damage per creature, and then you can tap this land and they'll become 2/1 creatures. You also only need a single mountain for it to avoid coming into play tapped, which is a bit easier than Dwarven Mine. Personally, I would put at least 2 copies of this land in due to the only single mountain requirement, and it's always handy to have.
I hope to serve you again.
Alright, time for me to shut up and put my cards where my mouth is.
Better than having a plan? Basically, anything. Go get 'em, buddies! cares right now?